Hello and welcome to class. Today we are going to be discussing the essay The Power and the Glory, written by Charles Taliaferro and Craig Lindahl-Urben. Let's begin. So please make sure that you have your superheroes and philosophy textbook, grab some pencil and some paper, and get ready to take some notes. Let's begin by talking about the components of their essay. Their overarching claim is that power and glory can be corrupting, and that humanity should be careful to value human life over power. The purpose of their essay is to compare comic book characters to everyday life. This allows the authors to demonstrate that readers should be careful to value human life over the acquisition of power. There are multiple philosophies presented within this chapter, ranging from moral, ethics, utilitarianism, personalism, and a quote from Lord Acton. They also use many examples of comic book characters: Olympus, Galactus, Watcher, Silver Surfer, Fantastic Four, and they use a classical character, Icarus. Here you can see an image of the comic book character Galactus and the Silver Surfer. You will notice that Galacticus is in purple, and we discussed in class that purple usually means royalty of some sort. The Silver Surfer, of course, is silver. Silver borders on the line of white, and we talked in class that white can represent innocence. And as you learn from this chapter, the Silver Surfer does decide to join with Galacticus only to save his own planet, which would in turn save his family. So it's rather interesting that they don't choose white, but they choose a color that's closely associated with white. Silver Surfer is in that gray area of villain or hero, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Here you can see the image of the Fantastic Four. You definitely have Mr. Fantastic down here, the Thing, the Human Torch, and then this is Miss Storm. Up here is Dr. Doom. So this is the issue where the Fantastic Four does meet Dr. Doom. And again, we have Dr. Doom, the Silver Surfer, and the Fantastic Four. Notice that the color has changed from purple to green. That is rather important here. You can see that Mr. Fantastic and Sue Storm are standing together instead of in separate areas. They are a married couple. They are in their human form, whereas Ben Grimm is still in the form of the Thing, and Johnny Storm, which is Sue's brother, is in the form of the Human Torch. Now that we've looked at the comic book covers and you have a better idea of the comic book characters, let's go and look at the essay itself. So this is Chapter 6 in your Superheroes and Philosophy textbook, The Power and the Glory, written by Charles Taliaferro and Craig Lindahl-Urben. It would be too cumbersome for me to take pictures of my physical textbook, which is what I usually show you during a class lecture. So I have my Kindle book up on the screen for you. I've also gone through here and did some highlighting so that you can follow along easier in your textbook. So if you'll look at the bottom of the screen down here, it should show you which page to be on physically in your textbook. So I'm looking, and it is on page 62. And if I go to the first full paragraph following the title, it still shows down here at the bottom of the screen that we are on page 62. You should be able to easily follow along with me as I'm using the Kindle edition and you are using your physical textbook. So as I said earlier, The authors are wanting to argue that humans should be very careful about the acquisition of power and the quest for glory. They maintain that humans tend to become overzealous and that they can fall into evil because they forget to value human life as much as they do the desire for power and glory. And I find it rather interesting that if you look at the very first line of their text, they say, "A powerful river of narrative flows from our tradition of reflection on virtue and vice in the ancient Greek stories of their gods and heroes down to the modern world where we continue to dramatize the battle between good and evil in our tales of heroic adventure and conflict." Now, I've highlighted virtue and vice because we just finished reading Tom Morris's essay about Matt Murdock and the Daredevil. And in his essay, he was talking about the double power principle and the yin-yang theories, in which just as much capability as Murdock has for good, he can also fall into the capability of evil. Here, these authors are continuing that discussion about how it is important to have balance in one's life so that we can, live a moral life. And so let's look further about what they say. The morality that we find in the mainstream superhero comic books is very similar to the morality and general wisdom that emerges from ancient philosophical ethics. So we are taking ancient classical text, we're taking comic book text, we're going to use these as evidence and apply it to our everyday life. And this is what my note says. Use comic books to discuss morals and philosophy. So we know the purpose of their essay is to try to convince us that we should not fall into the same traps that our beloved comic book characters fall into, that we should value human life more than our desire for power. Let's look at the next paragraph. There's one set of lessons in particular that we can find in both the ancient stories and in the modern comic panels. The pursuit of power and glory is as dangerous as it is seductive. The highest glory that can be attained by human beings must come as a side effect of other worthy pursuits and always consist, at least in part, in an understanding that people are more valuable than power. So they have explicitly stated their thesis, and they're letting you know how they're going to proceed with their essay. Now, the first comic book characters that they choose to use are Olympus and Galacticus. But before they proceed there, they want to show you that this is not a new concept, that comic book characters are actually drawing from classical stories. So they begin, in early Greek myths, we are often reminded of the danger of recklessly seeking preeminent praise and glory. In the story of Icarus, for example, a young man perishes because of his pursuit of glory. He is given wings that are glued to his body, enabling him to soar over the Mediterranean. Intoxicated by his new superhuman powers, he flies too close to the sun, and the sun melts his wings and he falls to his death. So now that the authors have showed you that the pursuit of power and glory can be traced all the way back to classical times, they're now going to relate it back to their comic book characters and back to society. They say lessons from such stories abound in which a misuse of power reveals to us, society, humans, the great harm that can come from a foolish or malicious pursuit of grandeur. This theme is reflected in many comic book stories about the villains and supervillains with whom the superheroes have to deal with. So again, the misuse of power is a return sentence back to their thesis claim, and they are letting you know, hey, look, this isn't just right now in comic book stories. We can go all the way back to ancient classical times, and we can see the same lesson that we are currently seeing in these comic book stories. Now that the authors have proven to us that these stories exist from classical times until current times, they're going to bring us along further into their argument. They bring in the Fantastic Four and the 1960s comic books. They introduce you to Dr. Doom and they introduce you to Galacticus. They briefly tell you about each one of the Fantastic Four members and how they're interrelated with one another. And then they bring this brilliant quote from Ben, who says that superheroes should use their powers to help mankind. Now, this quote itself is contributing to the author's overall argument related to the purpose for power. So the authors are saying, look, even our comic book characters are telling us that we should use our powers to help each other, not to fulfill our own selfish pursuit for power and glory. They continue to show us that the Fantastic Four, although they face numerous foes, that we can look to them as an example because they choose to operate from a highly ethical perspective. They're not seduced by the lure of power and glory, unlike Dr. Doom, who is. After they've provided you with some return sentences back to their thesis claim, and they've supported the fact that power can be seductive, they bring in more evidence. Fantastic Four issue 5 and Fantastic Four issue number 48. They talk to you about Galacticus and Doom. They tell you that Galacticus is a cosmic force almost beyond good and evil, that it is an immense being who must destroy and consume whole worlds in order to survive. And to help him survive, Galacticus has blackmailed the Silver Surfer into looking for planets for him to devour. Now that they've set up the overarching theme for power and glory, and they've shown you some villains and they've shown you some heroes, they want to look further at how a pursuit for power and glory can be doomed. And in order to do this, they bring in more evidence, issues 57 through 60 of Fantastic Four, and they remind you that Galacticus has threatened the existence of Earth, and that for us as readers, we have an excellent opportunity to look at morals regarding how we should use power and how we should not be so consumed for the search of glory and power, but we should be more consumed for human life. And if you look on page 64, let's read this paragraph regarding the Silver Surfer. The Silver Surfer had borne his awesome power with great measure of philosophical equanimity. He was a tranquil, wise, dignified, and calm person, and would never proclaim his power and glory the way Dr. Doom did immediately upon attaining it. In addition, the Silver Surfer aimed only to serve with his power. Doom aimed only to be served. So what they're doing here is comparison and contrast writing. They're showing you that Dr. Doom is all about bragging about the abilities that he has, and he wants to use those abilities. He doesn't care what's going to happen to other sentient life. Whereas the Silver Surfer, he does definitely care. He cares so much that he allows himself to become enslaved to help Galacticus look for planets to devour, because the Silver Surfer is concerned about saving his own planet and his own wife. It is that action of the Silver Surfer being willing to sacrifice other people in order to save his own that becomes questionable as to whether or not he's a hero, a vigilante, or a villain, and that's something that we'll continue to discuss. It's also something that I want you to think about. But what the authors are trying to do here is they're trying to show you the differences between somebody who only wants power and is going to brag about power, and somebody else who does have power, doesn't brag about it, and tries to use it in a manner that does not hurt his community. Now notice the emphasis on his, because he's trying to preserve his planet. He hasn't come to the realization yet that sometimes he is going to have to make a tough decision in the future, because maybe he's going to have to sacrifice his planet in order to save the entire universe. And in order to support this thought, the authors discuss more about Dr. Doom and the Silver Surfer, and they talk about possessing cosmic power, and they bring in this famous quote from Lord Acton, and I'm sure that you've heard this quote before. He's a famous historian, and he is quoted as saying, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." You can use this footnote here, and what Acton actually wrote was, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." So let me go back to where I was. Now that the authors have corrected the misuse of Lord Acton's quote and showed you the correct quote, they apply the philosophy and the sources back to the Silver Surfer and Dr. Doom. So if we look here on the screen, we can see from these contrasting examples of the Silver Surfer and Dr. Doom, we can easily infer the more nuanced philosophical conclusion that it is not power itself that is necessarily corrupting. Rather, it's the interaction of power with the vessel into which it is poured. If a person already has the character flaws to incline him toward corruption, then something like a sudden attainment of power can act on those flaws and send him into a fast downward spiral. So, this is really great writing. What the authors have done is they have introduced you to their topic, which is power and glory. They show you that this issue can be traced all the way back to classical times. They show you that it is still relevant and still current by looking at comic book characters. Later on in the chapter, they'll even reference comic book movies. And they show you that it can easily, that the pursuit of power can easily cause somebody to go over the edge, to fall out of balance, and to only lust after power and glory instead of to be more thoughtful towards humanity. And that's what they're doing here. They're writing a comparison and contrast paper regarding those who misuse power and glory and those who value human life more. And they're using comic book examples to do just that. The authors continue to compare and contrast Dr. Doom and the Silver Surfer. They continue to show you the word choices of both of the characters and how each of these characters contribute to the fact that one is more concerned about power and the other one is just enslaved into a relationship that's choosing him to make the choices to help somebody devour entire planets so that he could save his own. And if you look on page 65, after they've done this comparison and contrast example, they say, an individual who is not corrupted by the acquisition of power is not destroyed by the loss of it. And this is very important because this is a point that they will come back to later on in their essay, in which the Fantastic Four finally convince the Silver Surfer to stop being a scout for planets. And it's in that moment that the Silver Surfer realizes that yes, he's been protecting his planet, and in that sense he's been a hero for his planet, but at what cost? That cost is that he's costing other sentient beings their lives. And so if you look here, he says he is comforted in knowing who he is, with or without power or glory. The Surfer's jailer taunts him with the uselessness of that comfort in light of Doom's power, and the Silver Surfer responds, "Your master shall never prevail. Though he possesses power absolute, it is power usurped. Somehow, as surely as the cosmos stands, it must destroy him. If we can get beyond the hyperdramatic prose here, we can glimpse a fundamental belief in an underlying justice in the cosmos. So this is a very important philosophical undertone that the authors are using. So they're not saying that there's this great capital G God that determines how people are going to be treated. They're saying that the cosmos determines what will happen in people's lives. So keep that in mind as you continue to read their argument. They redirect the reader back to the central point of contact between the Marvel universe and ancient philosophers. And they say that the moral rule of justice will eventually prevail. It's built into the fabric of things. This is going back to what we were just talking about, justice in the cosmos. In this particular case of power and its misuse, the laws of cosmic justice dictate that if a person who is not able to handle power gains it, especially by unethical means, it will destroy him or her. So, again, the authors do not believe in a capital G God that distributes punishment or provides accolades. They believe in the cosmic justice, and they're demonstrating this between these two characters. The real problem with power isn't ever the mere of having it. The problem arises over what kind of person holds and wields it. Power and glory doesn't exist in a vacuum. They have profound roles to play in the character and actions of people. So this here is a set of return sentences reminding you, the reader, of their claim. Now, for the next few paragraphs, they talk more about the Silver Surfer and how the Silver Surfer became enslaved to the point of having to look for planets. And you can read that on your own. And then on page 66, the authors remind us, world history shows us once an urge for power and glory takes control of a person, it's very difficult to break free of it. Now notice they say that you're not able to. They just say that it's difficult. And so then they say, let's go look back at the 1960s and take a look at Dr. Doom and the Silver Surfer. So they're taking you back to the comic book characters. This would be a transition sentence. And they bring in morality. The moral prediction made by the Silver Surfer and reestablishes the cosmic order that was upset when Doom stole his power. The same moral order that is overturned when anyone with bad motives and a corrupt heart uses other people merely as a means of his own selfish ends, involving power or glory, or for that matter, money, status, or fame. This is really good writing. What they're doing is they're taking their claim, they're using return sentences to remind you what they've been saying. They go and apply it to their evidence, which is the comic book characters. Then they bring in morality, they bring in philosophy, and they relate it back. They apply it back to the comic book characters, and then immediately they take it back to the morals that they're discussing, and they say, hey, look, although these people are dealing with power and glory, we can also apply the same thing in our everyday lives in regards to money, status, and fame. This is very smooth writing. I really enjoy this essay because they're showing us how we can apply what it is that they're talking about in their essay to our everyday life. They continue to say that Doom's selfish arrogance sets him up for a mistake. When he makes it, the ultimate source of his power is there to take it away. Galacticus, in the end, strips Doom of what was never rightfully his. So again, this supports the fact that they believe that the cosmos will deliver justice. Sorry about that. That was my dog, Princess Leia. She was coming in here to let me know that she needed to go outside. I have her taken care of, so let's return back to our essay. I really love the way that the authors end this portion of this subsection, they have a great return sentence. They say, doom is portrayed as the ultimately self-serving ego, and the Silver Surfer is depicted by contrast as a model of self-giving service. So they have comparison and contrast writing going on. They have a return sentence to their claim, which is talking about power and glory, and they're applying it to their evidence, which is the comic book characters. This is great. Now they're going to move on to their next section, which is Galacticus, the power and the glory. So let's look at it. They introduce you to the Fantastic Four, they introduce you to Galacticus, the Silver Surfer, and the Watcher. So Galacticus is this being that needs to eat planets in order to stay alive. The Silver Surfer is the person who is enslaved to him to go find the planets for him to devour. The Fantastic Four are trying to stop Galacticus from devouring the Earth, and the Watcher is partaking in this conversation as well. So let's look at this conversation that we're having. So the Watcher says, heed my words, pillager of the planets. This tiny speck of matter upon which we stand contains intelligent life. You must not destroy it. And Galacticus responds, of what import are brief nameless lives to Galacticus? It is not my intention to injure any living being. I must replenish my energy. If petty creatures are wiped out when I drain a planet, it is regrettable but unavoidable. Watcher, since you seem familiar with those puny creatures, I suggest you advise them to hold their tongues before I erase them in one stroke. The Watcher responds, take warning, Galacticus. They are less puny than you think, and the Watcher stands beside them in this fateful hour. And Galacticus says, then you would violate your pledge, never to interfere in cosmic affairs? So be it. Despite your power, which I know full well, it must not be forgotten. I am supreme unto myself. I am Galacticus. So the big guy backs down, but not before that last little bit, of self-promotion. And of course, Galacticus is talking about himself in third person. And the authors here point out this exchange of dialogue between the Watcher and Galacticus. And they want you to notice that Galacticus first attempts to morally justify his actions by making an ethical distinction between what he intends to do and the unintended consequences of it. He needs to consume a planet in order to maintain his own existence and power, so that is what he intends, a good nurturing meal. He knows that intelligent sentient beings will be killed by his action, but protests to the Watcher that this is at worst an unfortunate side effect, but not an intended result about what he is about to do. So here, evil tries to justify his actions. Now I want you to think about, TV shows, movies, think about songs, artwork, think about, all these popular culture medium that we have. And do you see other places where evil tries to justify what it is about to do? We see it all throughout comic book movies, but we also see it all throughout history. Think about the United States when they decimated the Native American population. What they intended to do was to claim the land for themselves. What happened was genocide was committed. Think about Hitler. Hitler intended to, quote, preserve the Aryan race. And genocide was committed. So, although we're taking this philosophical concept in a comic book setting, comic book writers are allowing us as readers to think about our actions as humans, to think about our actions as society, and to think about what it is that we do. Yes, we intend to do something, but do we always fully think about the consequences? And here, comic book writers are urging us, slow down. Think about what it is that you're doing. just a few lines down, it says it's no more convincing here than it is when used by a greedy corporate executive or a corrupt politician. Yeah, it happens all the time. People get so caught up in power and glory that they stop to think about the consequences. How many times have we been mad at corporate America because we feel like they're making decisions just to line their pockets instead of thinking about the everyday American who has to live with the consequences of business being shipped overseas and the loss of jobs? How many times do we get mad because a corrupt politician is able to get out of, punitive damages or a criminal legislative sentence and serve time in jail? The pursuit of power and glory has long-reaching consequences, and this is what these authors are urging us to take a look at. Now that they've applied it to our everyday lives, they go back and they apply it to their evidence, which is the comic book heroes and the supervillains. And so they urge us to go back to the story. And they want us to look at the ineffectual attempts by the Fantastic Four to challenge Galacticus. And they walk through this challenge. They tell you about the stories. They give you some dialogue from these stories. And they go back to this dialogue between the Watcher and Galacticus. Now, the Fantastic Four has created this machine that's supposed to be able to stop Galacticus from devouring the Earth. And the Watcher implores Galacticus again. And he says, "Consider the courage they display," they being the humans. "Though they are still in their infancy, you must not disdain them. Did not your race and mine evolve from such humble beginnings? Do they not possess the seed of grandeur within their frail human frames?" Galacticus says, "But what of Galacticus? What of the limitless energy I must absorb if I am to survive?" And the Watcher says, "There are other planets. We both know full well that the universe is endless. Destroying a race cannot be the answer." And Galacticus says, "I grow weary. The prize is not worth the battle. Let the human surrender his weapon, and I shall tarry here no longer." The Watcher looks over at the Fantastic Four and he says, "Do as he says, mortal. The promise of Galacticus is living truth itself." And so Reed Richards takes the weapon, which is the ultimate nullifier, and he gives it over to Galacticus. And Galacticus says, "So, for the first time since the dawn of memory, my will has been thwarted. But I bear no malice. Emotion is for lesser beings." And so then the authors wrap up this dialogue. They say, "Before he leaves, Galacticus proclaims, 'The game is ended, the prize has eluded me, and at last I perceive the glint of glory within the race of man. Be ever worthy of that glory, humans. Be ever mindful of your promise of greatness, for it shall one day lift you beyond the stars or bury you within the ruins of war. The choice is yours." Now think about it. This is written in the 1960s. Think about all the wars that America has been through. Think about the wars that it was currently undergoing. And think about all the wars that were yet to come that the comic book writers had not yet experienced. And think about the fact of the power that war has. Think about those weapons and the power to end human life. And so many times, so many of our politicians and warriors and things like that, they get caught up in the glory of the battle. But we as humans should stop to consider the consequences of everything. And this is what the authors here are trying to get you, trying to convince you to do, is to think about the consequences. And in order to do that, they're going to talk about the test of virtue. And they tell you about Galacticus and how he's hovering on the edge of ethics, and they move on and they apply it to the Marvel universe and they apply it to the DC universe. And it's very important to note that these two authors aren't just looking at one set of comic book characters, they're looking at the entire genre. And they say the ethical framework for superheroes has a completely different form of logic than the ethics drawn on to describe the actions of villains. So we have comparison and contrast writing going on. The context in which supervillains are created and judged is a kind of reverse utilitarianism. Now, in literary terms, we call this an inverse. Utilitarianism, simply and roughly described, is the philosophical view that the right action in any circumstance is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So please write down utilitarianism, write down the philosophical viewpoint for which it is, and note how these authors are applying this in their argument. So they're saying that superheroes have a different form of logic than the villains. So let's look at how they're comparing and contrasting this and how they're going to apply it. They go on to say that the actions of superheroes is not based on either utilitarianism or its corresponding negative perversion of it. Rather, superheroes act from the belief that damage to a single person, especially an innocent, cannot be tolerated. Superheroes do not engage in utilitarian thinking. This is very important to note. When presented with the choice between saving an innocent individual and saving a group of people, the typical superhero is capable of making the choice, is incapable of making the choice. Indeed, perhaps even more than the immense powers granted to him or her. The inability to make this choice is what finally defines what it is to be a hero. So again, we're adding to the continuum of opinion regarding the definitions of a superhero. A superhero is incapable of making the choice regarding which individual or which group of people to save. So, what makes a hero? It is what the hero does next that raises him to the superhero status. He or she saves both the innocent individual and the group. They can't make a choice between either one or the other because in a superhero's perspective, both are equally important and both need to be saved. So the superhero is always focused on the intrinsic value of the individual person and the ability to defeat the foe. So this brings us to a new form of philosophy. And this philosophy is called personalism. It's a philosophy that considers any person to be of fundamental and irreducible value. So, if we're looking at the continuum of opinion regarding a hero, another characteristic of a superhero is that they adopt a personalistic philosophical perspective. Now, personalism, there are many people that have contributed to this philosophy, but your book mentions Borden Parker Brown, which is from 1847 to 1910, Martin Buber, which is 1878 to 1965, and then they also add in a little bit later Immanuel Kant, which is 1724 to 1804. So, personalists think that all people are fundamentally important. You can't value one more than the other. So let's read this. Personalists do not calculate the value of a person in reference to their own self-centered goals, as Dr. Doom would, or in accordance with standard utilitarianism, where the good of the many can outweigh the good of the one individual. Each person is of absolute value. Now, personalism has its roots in both religious ethics and the work of philosopher Immanuel Kant, who contended that every person should be treated as an end in himself or herself and never merely as a means to an independent end. So personalists, as well as Kantians, they see the heedless manipulation of persons as an unjustifiable wrong. Both personalists and Kantians are committed to the idea of a just community in which all individuals are able to flourish, they all have respect, they all have dignities, and that they all need to subscribe to the ethics of making sure that everybody is valued equally. So the personalist ethic, the proper role of power or glory in an individual's life is always judged in connection with how that person respects others and how that power or glory affects the strengthening of the greater community. Neither is to be pursued for its own sake or for the sake of the individual self. Rather, every single person should value everybody equally, and all should be focused on the community being strong and healthy. And that's what a superhero has to do. A superhero must be concerned with everybody within the community. That's why they can't easily make the choice as to who to save. Now, our authors take us back to the Marvel Universe. They take us back to the Fantastic Four and Doctor Doom and Galacticus, and they look at all the different morals and the point of views that are going on. And they say that Galacticus hovers on the edge of ethical behavior, and that he's on the outside of good and evil. He's almost amoral. And they talk about the two reasons that he's amoral. And first is he has to consume planets in order to survive. So his existence requires the death of others. But what's interesting is that the authors point out that this is analogous to human beings who have to eat food that humans deem are lower on the food chain. This made me think of that meme that I saw on Facebook about vegetarians, and it shows plants, and it's questioning vegetarians why they get mad at carnivores for eating meat when vegetarians eat plants. It just made me chuckle. It made me think about that. So we have Galacticus, who is now amoral, because the reason that he's doing his actions is to survive. And we as humans, we devour other things in order to survive. So the authors state this: Galacticus obviously doesn't consider those he consumes to be part of a mutual moral community. This unfortunately but also clearly captures the normal attitude that most of us have towards the rest of the natural world, including the animal kingdom. This is brilliant writing. The authors are using a high level of pathos, a high level of emotion, to compel the reader to consider their own actions. Now, I wonder how many of you would think that this is fallacious, meaning that you're like, you know what, the example that they're using is ridiculous. But I challenge you just to stop and think about it for a moment. If Galacticus has to consume things in order to stay alive, and we as humans have to consume animal and plant products to stay alive, how is it different? And that is what the authors are questioning us. How are we any different than Galacticus? And this is what they say. Galacticus not only doesn't respect them, he also doesn't even recognize them as fellow moral beings at all. So do we as humans respect and honor the earth and the animals and the plants that we consume in order to stay alive? Or do we disrespect the earth? These are some of the questions that are underpinning this topic of conversation that we're having about these comic book characters. And to even further drive it home, I really love this line here. Cosmic Cheerios. He would take on the crucial stance of an ethical being with regard to us, and not just that of a hungry giant looking for his next bowl of Cosmic Cheerios. And of course, the Watcher was right. Think about that word choice, Cheerios. And think about adding cosmic to it. Cosmic Cheerios. Cheerios, a well-known cereal that many people eat. But remember, the authors believe in cosmic justice. They believe that the cosmos will bring justice to all of those. So if Galacticus is going to have cosmic justice, will we as humans also have cosmic justice for our choices? I would like for you to think about that question and bring your answer to class. So the authors begin to wrap up their argument, and they say those glimmerings of greatness for humans involve both glory and power. From the histories of individual Marvel superheroes and their supervillains, we are able to see that glory and power can accrue to us in perfectly acceptable ways. But they are not something we properly can seek to attain for ourselves, for our own selfish benefit. Power and glory can be rightly acquired, but only as proper consequence of morally appropriate actions. So this is that balance. This is that double power principle. This is that yin and yang that we've been learning about. Yes, we can get power and glory, but it needs to be in balance with everything else. And we need to be careful to think about the consequences of our actions. They go on to say, and they can be properly used for the good of the moral communities, not as tools for the pursuit of self-centered goals. Only the bad guys like Dr. Doom pursue power and glory for their own sake, and then for the sake of further selfish ends. The Fantastic Four, by contrast, use both their power and their glory for the good of other people. They represent the moral point of view and constitute among themselves a moral community that opens itself to broader and broader communities where they can make a difference for the good. This is very interesting. So the authors have been making an analogy of humans eating food and animal products to Galacticus, who is eating planets, and yet the authors come back and they say that we are a moral community. So they are building the reader back up, and they are saying, look, we know that you have good. Are you going to use that good for your community? So it becomes a challenge for the readers. And in order for us to help meet this challenge, they take us back to another encounter where the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, and Doctor Strange encounter Galacticus again. He's dying, and everybody could let him die, and they'd never have to worry about Galacticus threatening Earth or any other planet for that sake. And yet, as he's laying there dying, the personalist ethics of the superheroes kick in. And Captain America says, but Galacticus is living, sentient being, and he does not act out of evil intent. He does what he must simply to survive, just as we would. Reed Richards stops to think about what Captain America is saying, and Richards says, Captain America is right. We are bound to help Galacticus. And so all of them help to save Galacticus. Galacticus wakes up and he's talking about himself in typical third person. He says, Galacticus lives! But Galacticus is confused. He's confused because they saved him. They could have let him die and he would never threaten them again. And so he questions them, why have you saved me? And Richard says, we had no choice, Galacticus. We could no more stand by and follow you to die than we could to turn our backs on any creature in need. The authors are making a poignant argument that we as human beings, we have the ability to balance our power with ethical decisions and moral decisions in order to make our communities great, in order to build a great future for ourselves. And as the authors continue to write about Galacticus, they say they are individuals worthy of real moral consideration, demanding his respect and recognition. Galacticus made a move toward the ideal of a personalist model because Galacticus chose to let them live. He chose to view them as not beneath him, but as worthy. And the authors end their essay with this wonderful closing statement. In his tale of power, fall, restoration, and change, we see in contemporary storytelling context some of the early Greek philosophical warnings about the ills of hubris and vainglory, and the philosophical perspective that any of us will flourish best in a peaceful community of ethical action where the intrinsic value of all persons is recognized and respected. These are lessons from the best ancient philosophy, and they can be found vividly portrayed in contemporary superhero stories. This is great. What they did is they reminded you that they went all the way back to Greek stories and that they pulled in philosophy and they applied it to superhero stories, and that these lessons are still viable to our contemporary society. It was wonderful writing. Now my question is, did they convince you of their claim? Did they convince you that power and glory can be misused? And that it's up to us to make sure that we have moral communities and communities that recognize other living beings, that we have a responsibility for our power and our glory. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. You can leave comments below in the YouTube video section, or you can bring your comments to class. Either way, I've enjoyed talking to you about this chapter in the Superheroes textbook. It built upon Tom Morris's chapter about Matt Murdock, and we're getting ready to continue our discussion in our next chapter about myth, morality, and the women of X-Men, written by Rebecca Hassel. Thank you for coming, and I'll see you again.